All right, so today we're going to dive into the world of Python. I always hear Python is beginner friendly,
Right.
but what does that even mean?
Yeah.
We've got this YouTube tutorial from Tech Studio 24,
Right.
and it seems like the perfect place to unpack that.
Yeah, and not just for beginners, I think. Python's simplicity is a huge part of why it's so popular. Everything from just like simple scripts to really complex machine learning algorithms.
Okay, so it's not just me. I'm curious to see how this tutorial kind of breaks things down.
Yeah. Well, they start with the absolute basics, which is great. If you're building a house, you want to start with the foundation.
Right.
And then it shows how all those pieces can come together in actual code.
It's like you wouldn't start building a house from the roof down, right?
Exactly.
You need that solid base. So they kick off by calling Python simple and easy to learn.
Mhm.
But they don't just tell us, they actually show us with the good old print statement,
Right.
which is how we communicate with the computer in Python.
Yeah, the print statement, it's basically like saying hey, Python, show me the results. And they use the example print Tech Studio 24
No.
to show how that works.
So if I was writing code and I wanted to display something,
Yeah.
print would be my go-to.
Exactly. Think of it as your way to get Python to talk back to you.
Makes sense. Now things get really interesting with variables. The tutorial uses this analogy of containers and objects. Imagine a container, like any container you like. That's your variable name.
Okay.
The object is the actual stuff that you put inside that container.
I love that analogy because it makes it so clear. That container or variable is just a way to store and organize your data in Python. So you could have a container labeled name and you put the data John inside.
Right, so that would be like name equals John, which the tutorial calls a string variable. And then you could have age equals 21, which is an integer variable.
You got it. And there's different types of these containers or variables depending on what kind of data you want to store. They mentioned strings, integers, floats, and booleans are kind of the major players there.
It's like having different shaped containers for different things that you want to store. I'm really curious about these data types and how they all work together.
Yeah, and the cool part is the tutorial doesn't just list them out. They actually show you like a visual representation of a container holding these different data types.
Oh, so you can actually see what they mean by container.
Yeah,
That's way more helpful than me just trying to picture it in my head.
definitely. Visualizing abstract concepts, I think, is so powerful, especially when you're first starting out.
For sure. Okay, so let's break down these different data types, starting with strings. What makes strings so special?
Well, as the tutorial explains, strings are your go-to for storing text. Think of them like containers that are specifically designed to hold letters, words, sentences. Really any sequence of characters that you can dream up. You always define them within quotation marks, like we saw Hello World earlier.
So anything within those quotation marks, Python knows to treat as text.
You got it. It's Python's way of differentiating between instructions and the actual information that you want to work with.
That makes sense. Pseudo integers. Those seem pretty straightforward from the way the tutorial explains it.
Yeah, they are. Integers are your whole numbers, no decimals allowed. Think of things like the number of apples in a basket, the number of lines in a program, or even your age.
Okay, so if I was writing a program to track how many points someone scores in a game, I would use an integer to store that data.
Exactly. Integers are great for representing those countable quantities.
Gotcha. Now, what about floats? Those sound a bit fancier.
They do. Floats are like the more precise cousins of integers. They get to handle the numbers with decimals, like
Wow.
3.14 for pi or 2.7 for anything that needs that extra bit of accuracy.
So if I was building a program to calculate the area of a circle, I would definitely want to use floats to make sure those calculations are on point.
Absolutely. Floats give you that flexibility when you're dealing with numbers that aren't always whole.
Now, booleans, those always seemed a bit mysterious when I was first starting out. The tutorial describes them like a yes or no switch, either true or false.
That's a great way to put it. Imagine you're asking Python a yes or no question. For example, is the sky blue? That would be true. Or you could ask, is 10 greater than 20? That would be false.
Okay, I think that's starting to click for me. So after giving us this breakdown of data types, the tutorial switches gears a little bit and jumps into actually writing code using an IDE or an integrated development environment. They recommend Visual Studio Code, but emphasize that you can use others.
Right, it's like choosing your coding workspace. The IDE is where you'll actually type your code, run it, and see the results.
Let's start with a really basic example, showing how to declare a variable like name equals John, and then use the print statement to display its value.
Yeah, it's a perfect way to demonstrate how the code that you write translates into something tangible on the screen. They walk you through each step from writing the code to running it and seeing that output in the IDE's terminal.
It's like you're telling the computer what to do, and then boom, it does it. There's something so satisfying about that.
There really is. It's like you're speaking Python's language.
Now, things get even more interesting when they start showing how to combine variables, especially with strings. They use an example of putting a first name and a surname together.
Oh, yeah?
They use first name equals Terry, surname equals Bothing, and they use print, first name plus surname, to combine them. But they point out that you end up with Terry Bothing all smashed together, which isn't ideal.
Right, and this is a perfect example of how even small details matter in programming. That little space between the names makes a big difference in the output.
So how do you fix that?
It's actually a really simple fix. You just add a space within quotation marks like this, print first name plus G plus surname. That little boolean tells Python to insert a space between the two variables.
Wow, so that one tiny character makes all the difference. I'm starting to see how important it is to pay attention to all those little details when you're coding.
Yeah, it's all about understanding how Python is interpreting your instructions. Even a missing space can completely change what your code does.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, earlier we talked about these different data types, and the tutorial introduces this handy tool called the type function to check what type of data a variable is holding. They show it with print, type name, which reveals the data type of the variable name.
Yeah, it's like asking Python, hey, what kind of data am I dealing with here? This is incredibly useful, especially when you're working with more complex programs, and you need to make sure your variables are holding the right kind of information.
Yeah, I can see how that would be helpful. I remember when I was starting out, I would spend ages trying to figure out why my code wasn't working, only to realize that I had accidentally assigned the wrong data type to a variable.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there. It's such a common mistake. And the type function is a lifesaver in those situations.
That's like having a superpower that lets you peer into the soul of your variable.
Exactly. Now, the tutorial kind of circles back to those numeric classes we talked about earlier, integers and floats. And they emphasize how Python is actually a really powerful tool for doing math.
That's right. They use the example of 13.2 equals 6.5 to illustrate how Python handles division and data types. So that 6.5, because it has a decimal, means it's automatically treated as a float right.
You got it. Python's pretty smart about figuring out those data types on the fly. If it sees that decimal point, it knows you're working with a float. If not, it just assumes it's an integer.
That's really convenient. It's like Python's doing some of the thinking for us.
In a way it is. It's designed to be as intuitive as possible. And speaking of intuitive, remember our friend the Boolean?
Yes or no data type, how could I forget? The tutorial brings it back with another simple example. Is London in the UK true or false? It's such a clear way to illustrate how Boolean values work.
And more importantly, they link it back to how we actually use Booleans in programming. They're essential for setting up conditions and controlling the flow of our code.
So it's like setting up rules for our program to follow. If this is true, then do that. If it's false, do something else.
Exactly. They form the backbone of logic in programming. It's like building a decision-making system right into your code. It's like you're creating a flowchart for your code to follow, guiding it to make the right choices based on the information that it has.
That's a really cool way to think about it. So from what I'm gathering, Booleans aren't just about storing yes or no. They're about using those truth values to make decisions within our code.
You've got it. Imagine you're building a program and you want to check if someone's old enough to vote. You could use a Boolean to represent whether they meet that age requirement. And then based on that Boolean value, your program could either grant or deny access.
That makes so much sense. It's like those choose your own adventure books, where your decision leads you down a different path in the story. Booleans are like the decision points in our code.
That's a fantastic analogy. It's all about logic and flow control. And the best part is these basic building blocks of Python, like variables, data types, and Booleans. They can be combined and manipulated in endless ways to build incredibly complex programs.
So we've gone from a simple print, hello world, to understanding how to store data, identify its type, and even use Booleans to make decisions within our code. That feels like a lot. Did this tutorial cover anything about actually using these concepts in a more practical way?
You bet. The tutorial actually uses the example of building like a very simple calculator. And they even highlight the fact that because Python is so widely used in fields like data science, Learning these fundamentals really opens up a world of possibilities.
Wait, are you saying that the same basic principles that we're learning here
Yeah,
are used by data scientists to like crunch massive data sets and build predictive models?
absolutely. They might be working at a much larger scale. But the fundamental concepts of variables, data types, and logical operations are all there, forming the bedrock of their code.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like learning the alphabet of a new language.
Yeah.
Once you know those letters, you can start putting them together to form words, sentences, and eventually like entire stories.
Exactly. And the more you practice and experiment with these foundational concepts, the more fluent you'll become in expressing your ideas through code.
That's such a great way to put it. So what were your biggest takeaways from this tutorial? What really stood out to you?
What impressed me most was how this tutorial managed to distill these really fundamental concepts into such a clear and concise format. They didn't get bogged down in a lot of technical jargon or overly complex examples. They kept it simple, relatable, and engaging, which is so crucial for beginners.
I totally agree. And the visual aids they used, like that container analogy, were incredibly helpful in driving home those abstract concepts.
Absolutely. Sometimes all it takes is that one perfect analogy or visual representation to really make a concept click. And this tutorial did a fantastic job of providing those aha moments.
It's amazing how much ground this tutorial covered.
Yeah.
Just by focusing on those core concepts, it really does feel like you're unlocking this whole new way of thinking and problem solving.
It is. It's like you're learning this new set of tools. And once you have those tools, the possibilities of what you can build are endless. You know, it's funny. I remember when I first started learning to code, I got so caught up in trying to memorize every single command and syntax rule. And it just felt so overwhelming.
No, I hear that. I remember thinking, am I ever going to remember all of this?
Exactly. But then I realized it's not about memorization. It's about understanding the logic, the building blocks, and then knowing how to use those building blocks to create something new.
So it's more about problem solving and creativity than just rate memorization.
Precisely. And that's what makes programming so exciting. It's like a puzzle where you have all these different pieces, and your job is to figure out how to fit them together to create something meaningful.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of puzzles, what about that calculator example? How does that tie into everything we've been talking about?
Well, think about what a calculator does. It takes in some input from the user, performs some calculations, and then displays the result. We now have the basic building blocks to do all of that in Python.
Wait, so you're telling me that with just the print statement, variables, data types, and a little bit of Boolean logic, we could build a basic calculator in Python?
Absolutely. It might not be the most sophisticated calculator in the world, but it would demonstrate a fundamental understanding of how to use Python to solve a real-world problem. For example, you could create variables to store the numbers that the user wants to calculate with, use input functions to capture those numbers from the user, and then use mathematical operators to perform the calculations.
And then use the trusty print statement to display the answer. Wow. It's amazing how all these seemingly simple concepts can come together to do something so powerful.
It's like they say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Each of these concepts on its own might seem pretty basic, but when you combine them, you can create something truly remarkable.
That's such a great point. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired right now and ready to start building their own Python creations, what advice would you give them? Where should they go from here?
The best advice I can give is to just start coding. Don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, try things out. There are so many fantastic resources available online, from interactive tutorials to open source projects. That can really help you take your Python skills to the next level.
That's fantastic advice. And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will go on to create the next big thing in the world of Python.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up this deep dive?
Just remember, learning to code is a journey, not a destination. There's always something new to discover. And the more you learn, the more you realize how much more there is to learn. Embrace the challenge, have fun with it, and never stop exploring the incredible world of Python programming.
Beautifully said. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into Python basics. We hope you enjoyed this episode and feel inspired to start your own coding adventure. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and that curiosity flowing.